138,000 jobs could be at risk by net zero policies that are being pursued by both major parties. That's in the New South Wales state election. New analysis suggests the promise of net zero could have big effects, in particular on rural and regional Australians. Nearly 63,000 agricultural jobs and 20,000 coal and mining jobs are in the gun. The data suggests less than 10% of those jobs could actually be made up in so-called green jobs. Joining me now for more on this, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild, the IP, having released this analysis. Thanks for your time. So just zeroing in on the wording here, 138,000 jobs at risk. Reading this report, that's the total number of jobs in these sectors that you're adding up that have more than average emissions. So are you saying all of those jobs could go, or just they could be at risk?
Look, all of those jobs are at risk, and this is not an abstract concern. We can see across Australia. We've also had pledges to implement a methane tax, which will be focused on the agricultural sector, and a push that's commenced in the ACT, but is growing around the country to ban petrol cars in Australia. So that's the oil, coal, agriculture and transport sectors. And what's very clear is whether you look domestically or internationally, if you want to meet a net zero emissions target, that means the industries that are higher emitting are going to have to incur the greatest costs. And it's in parts like where we are today in Tamworth and Muswellbrook and the Upper Hunter that are going to pay the price. What our analysis shows is up to 2/3 of those 138,000 jobs which are at risk are located in rural and regional parts of New South Wales.
So you've defined any industry that's above average emissions in the country as at risk. It seems a pretty sort of blunt calculation. I mean, let's take agriculture, because nearly half of the jobs you're talking about out of the 138 are in agriculture, just over 60,000. You've got a lot of technology in there, carbon soil farming. You have feed that reduces emissions in cows, for example. There are lots of technological ways to reduce emissions. Are they factored into what you're saying here?
Look, they are factored in, and you're right, it is a very large potential job loss. But again, I come back to the policies that we're seeing out of the capital cities and Canberra. They're very clearly saying that the bulk of the emissions reductions are going to need to come from the energy sector, from the agricultural sector and from the transport sector. You only have to look at what's been happening internationally in Canada or the UK, for example, who are more advanced down the path of these net zero policies, to see that it's precisely those sectors that are incurring the greatest costs. And don't forget, this is a part of the world that is putting food on the plates of Australians, ensuring that we have the lights on. It's critical to our prosperity and our national security. My concern is a lot of the policies that we're seeing out of the cities is very short-sighted. We have AEMO today identifying that we have a critical energy shortfall, which just means higher prices. They're already going up very rapidly. And we face a very serious issue right here and right now on our national energy market, unless we get more energy suppliers onto the market.
So when you say those technologies are factored in, how so? Are you assuming that many of the technologies that not all of them are proven at scale, but in agriculture do take off, or they don't? And what's the cost of them? How have you factored them in?
Look, these technologies may or may not take off. We're talking about the jobs that are currently here right now that exist in communities like Tamworth or Armidale or Muswellbrook or Gunnedah. These are jobs that exist right now. Yes, there might be other jobs that come up in the future, but we have a problem right here, right now, whether it's in agriculture or whether it's in mining. And we've got to remember that we have a lot of promises coming out of, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Canberra. I'll give you an example of, solar farms which are being held up to be able to replace some of the jobs that are being lost in mining communities. Yes, there are jobs, and yes, it can be a part of the future. But many of these jobs are in the construction phase. The big solar farms only have about 300 to 400 jobs in the construction phase. Then you've only got about 30 or 40 jobs which are ongoing. And so the reality is in communities that really rely on a mining sector and an agriculture sector, the new green technologies simply aren't enough to replace the jobs which are being lost. And I'll just make one other observation. Some previous analysis we undertook on this found that over the past decade, for every one job that had been created in the renewable sector, 5 jobs had been destroyed in our manufacturing sector. So yes, there are jobs in these new green areas, but they're nowhere near as well paid, and there's not enough of them to sustain communities.
But renewable jobs don't necessarily take manufacturing jobs. Renewable jobs are energy. So what's the exact correlation you're drawing there?
Well, the correlation is twofold. Firstly, that we have a loss of traditional industry. So manufacturing is a prime example of that. That was a fairly stable industry, decently paid, full-time, that sustained a lot of outer suburban areas and regional parts of the country that is in decline. The other key point is that in order to have a viable manufacturing sector and a viable heavy industry sector or heavy industrial capacity, you've got to have 24/7 baseload power that's ready to go. AEMO has clearly said we're losing our baseload power supplies. Like I say, wind and solar can play a role,
Yeah,
but
we haven't lost it yet. We've still got baseload power.
Scale.
But you know, you're saying we've lost manufacturing jobs. That's been a trend for decades. I'm just wondering how you're linking that directly.
No, it's only really the last decade where you've seen a sharp drop to manufacturing. Yes, I accept they've been declining as a share of the total.
Big part was cars. I mean, that was a government decision on subsidies, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was a part of it. But we've also seen other areas of the manufacturing sector close down. And my key point here is quite simply that what we're told coming mostly out of Canberra, and by the way, this is both sides of politics that have been saying this, is that we're going to have this new technology that will provide 24/7 power. But wind and solar can't do that at scale. You know, this is the key point to make. It's experimental. We have no idea whether this is going to work. Now, I accept maybe 30, 40, 50 years down the track, there might be new technologies. Nobody knows that yet. But AEMO and the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission have made it clear.
It's not experimental. We know the technology. There are questions as to how much it might cost to... Well, it's not. It's about cost, right? So we know it works. It can be a question of cost and how many days do you need to back it up. So I accept there's some complexity there, but I don't think it's fair to call it experimental technology. What about green hydrogen? I mean, that could or could not work. That's certainly in the phase of we'll see. But if that does work, that could be a game changer. But what's your point there, that it might work, it might not, and that's the concern?
Yeah, I mean, the key word you used there is could. I mean, there's lots of things that could happen. But we've had key government bodies, AEMO today, reinforcing a series of analysis saying that right now, we have a practical problem. And my concern is we have a lot of political leaders that are talking about abstract things, technologies that may or may not come online. But we have families that are suffering with very high power bills and communities here in Tamworth and around the rest of the outer suburbs and regional Australia that risk losing their jobs today. This is not something we can wait for 10 or 20 years down the line.
Daniel Wild, we've got to leave it there. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.